Blaine Ensor. Good morning and welcome to Underground.
Good morning.
Thanks for coming. Just a little bit about Underground. We feature independently minded archaeologists, anthropologists, historians, and science renegades on controversial topics and themes such as early complex culture, unexpected finds, ancient migrations, diffusion, and ancient technology. And I would say today fits fairly well into the unexpected finds category. Underground digs deep with the world's most maverick minds, shedding light on ideas and theories usually discussed off stage in hushed tones. Why? Because these ideas and theories often emerge as facts when paradigms inevitably shift. So let's dig in. I am really happy to have here with me today Blaine Ensor, archaeologist extraordinaire from the University of Alabama. Originally, he's got undergraduate and graduate degrees from UA, and you had 40 or more years of archaeological research working in the private sector and also working with public universities. You're focused in the Southeast and the Midwest and in Texas. And although we've only just met, I was aware of your fine reputation among our colleagues for many years and first learned about your research from Bob Austin, who is an archaeologist I have utmost respect for. And he saw a presentation you gave at a SEAC conference. This was many years ago. It's got to be 6, 7 years ago. And he told me what you presented on, and I thought it was potentially game-changing and really fascinating. And I've been wanting to chat with you ever since. And there's a lot of pre-Columbian culture contact theories out there, but this one, it ranks up there as one of the most fascinating. So, with that, is there anything about your background that you'd like to add? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, I think, Mike, you did a pretty good job there. I have worked with public universities and private firms over the last 40 years and kind of started out in Alabama. I grew up in North Alabama, Huntsville, Alabama, and, we got a lot of prehistoric artifacts in the Tennessee Valley. So, kind of got interested in looking for those and collecting those as a teenager. And then when I went to the university, undergraduate, I think my sophomore year, I got involved in taking anthropology courses and just kind of went on from there, just kind of using some of my knowledge from, I kind of gleaned from the collecting in North Alabama, kind of give me a little bit of perspective as I went forward. And then entered the graduate program there, got my master's degree there in anthropology and worked down at Moundville for David DeJarnett, who everybody, of course, refers to as the father of Alabama archaeology, and kind of got grounded there and lucky enough to get timing was kind of right as far as, my working on my graduate degree and then having material to work on from the Tennessee Tombigbee Waterway. I started looking at the lithics from that big construction project, and from there I went on up to the University of West Florida, working on what I got dubbed as the Mid Mound Project. And fortunately for me, I was interested in lithics, so it was just a universe of lithics to look at from those sites. So, ranging from, what's commonly known as Paleo-Indian up through Mississippian, and just covered the whole gamut pretty much, and got to look at a lot of flakes and a lot of tools, and just kind of got a grounding there. Now, one thing that there wasn't anybody there really at the university that specialized in lithics, so I pretty much had to gather all the literature I could, and so I'm pretty much self-taught when it comes to that. Now later on, as I went around, I did attend George Odell's Lithic Institute up at the University of Tulsa back in I think '87, and he had some old world people come over like Martin Newcomer and some of the other ones. So I gradually over time with gained some experience, actually quite a bit of experience working with lithics, especially places like Texas A&M where we had, just all kind of sites we were dealing with over there that were, you know, beneficial in helping to understand some of the reduction sequences that go on when you're making thin bifaces and so forth. And then my own personal research, I got gradually over the years, just kind of, got interested in, I guess it kind of shifted some to the more earlier cultures. And for example, Clovis. So I spent a long time tracking down artifacts from a single component Clovis site in North Alabama, and finally got them together and published that. That was quite an undertaking. And not to get too far ahead here, but with the CAPS material at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, I'd heard about when I was an undergraduate student. I'm sorry, a graduate student at the university, and kind of always had in the back of my mind, I just said, well, if I ever get a chance, I'm going to go back and look at those because everybody that's had seen them said, well, they're different. They just don't seem to fit in, and I'm like, well, that kind of piqued my interest, and so eventually I was able to work my way back down there and pull those out and look at them.
So there are some people who may be listening that aren't familiar with the term lithics. So I'll just clarify. Lithics, it refers to stone tools, and the analysis is basically the study of stone tools. So it can be the tools and the debitage, the material that's is knocked off in the process of stone tool manufacture. And yeah, from our brief conversations before this interview, and reading your publications, you are definitely an expert in that space. It takes many years of hands-on examination and really experimental archaeology to get appreciation for various types of stone tool production, and so that's great. You mentioned that as a kid, kind of growing up in Alabama in the Huntsville area, you were interested in archaeology. That's where you got interested in archaeology. Were you one of those kids walking out through fields after rain, looking for arrowheads and hunting around by the creeks and that kind of thing?
Yeah, we had several, sites within, reasonable driving distance. So we after the rain, we'd go out there and freshly plowed field and see what we could find. And I'd say about once a month maybe. But I didn't really get started until I was probably around 13, 14, and then went kind of through high school.
Yeah.
But then after that,
Well, it seems to me that there's a common theme in a lot of folks who are professional archaeologists, and that they always had a passion for the topic, um, basically from childhood onward, and kept at it. So hats off to you for doing so.
yeah, well, that's one thing I forgot to mention is that when I was a kid, I kind of got ahead of myself there. When I was a kid, I remember going out to some friend's house down in Birmingham. I was probably 6, 7. Well, I could have been 7 or 8, I guess. But I remember going out in their backyard and walking around up in they got some, they call it the Piedmont over there. And I guess, well, actually the Appalachians come down in there too. But anyway, I was walking along back out there and I looked down the ground. I saw this quartz piece that looked like kind of, in my little brain, I guess it looked like an arrowhead or a projectile point. So I picked it up and I took it back in and showed it to my parents and their parents that were hosting us there. And they, oh, that's nothing, that's nothing, just a kid, picking up stuff. But I do remember doing that, having that interest at a very young age. And I think it's just something that's always intrigued me. And I guess the reason being is that I wanted to know what it was and what it represented. I wanted more information, than just it's there. So I need some kind of explanation. And
Yeah.
that's kind of what's driven me going forward.
It drives the curiosity, I think, for folks who have a passion for this subject, and you want answers, and you're kind of unsettled without them. You've worked in a lot of different places, and you mentioned a number of prestigious universities. You mentioned Texas A&M. And there's some terrific institutes down there with a focus on peopling of the New World. And you know, obviously the Institute for the First Americans is there. They're some of the best publications, and some of the earliest sites in North America are found in Texas as well. So, what was your experience like there, and how did it, and did you experience sort of an open-minded environment relative to people in the New World theories? Or expound on that if you would.
Yeah, well, actually, when I was there, it was, I think, from around 80, 81, 82 until 1990. So, you know, it was really before, a lot of the current controversies and interest had really blossomed, and really come forward. So mainly I was concentrating on cultural resource management. In other words, going out and, locating sites before a construction project, such as a reservoir or a highway or, uh, something like that. And, just finding significant sites and then doing testing and that, in some cases, full excavation, not full excavation, but, uh, just,
Yeah.
that's,
Well, so you were delving into Clovis sites and looking at that technology and you know, let's say manufacturing technique back in the 80s, which, you know, we were still predominantly dealing with a Clovis first model, Clovis via the Bering Land Bridge. Is that correct?
yeah, I mean, I've always had an interest in Clovis, but, in the 80s, obviously, but it wasn't until like around 1990, 91 that I actually was able to move back to Alabama and actually go out and look at the Belmina site, which is where I virtually a single component site. So you could actually study the Clovis technology there without pretty much without having to worry about admixture or mixing of artifacts from, later time periods. So, yeah, so that really came about in the early 90s. Now, getting back to Texas A&M, I didn't want to get off on that tangent, but uh, yeah, at that time I was aware of the Nautical Institute and George Bass, but surprisingly there was hardly any interaction between our archaeological research lab, which we did. Uh, we focused on obviously the sites that are on terrestrial sites, and so it was really, although there was obviously some interaction, same university, but really they were separate departments. And
Yeah. I was thinking of the Institute for the First Americans, which I don't think was at
what
A&M until,
wasn't there yet.
okay, that was sometime in the early 2000s. So yeah, you were there quite early.
Yeah,
Okay, so let's talk
Mike
about you.
Waters, Mike
Sorry, go ahead.
Waters was there at that time. He had just come in. I would have been there before him, and he's now the director of the institute out there. But yeah, I actually worked with Mike on some of the cultural resource management projects.
Yeah. Did you? Okay. Principles of Geoarchaeology. Terrific book. Read it cover to cover. Mike Waters. Um, okay. Well, so you get back to Alabama and you take a look at some Clovis materials. What was your perspective of Clovis at that time? Were you sort of following a more conventional, the conventional model of the New World migration?
Yeah, I think back then I probably was. I was really interested in understanding the technology and the variations and all the Clovis sites around the country, and just seeing how the North Alabama Clovis kind of fit in, kind of conformed or not, and all the Texas Clovis sites uh, and, uh, and others around the country, just to see if it was very similar, if there were any differences, and just kind of focused on you know understanding the technology and uh, just describing the technology at that particular site so that people would have it for comparative purposes.
Mhm. Okay. Well, we could talk a little bit more about your current perception of Clovis here in a bit. But let's talk about your first encounter, or your relationship with the caps and Shelley sites. And now I think you mentioned that you had heard about this early on, perhaps during your graduate work of this tool assemblage, and then you left for many years, and then you come back, and now you re-encounter these materials. Kind of walk us through that a bit.
Yeah, like I said, I had an opportunity back in, I think 2000, 2001, somewhere around there, to go down to Birmingham and go down to the University of Alabama and look at the artifacts that I'd heard about and relocate them. And managed to do that with some help and pull those out, started looking through them. And, and, I was kind of perplexed. I hadn't, I worked at Clovis sites and all the other sites I'd ever worked on through the years. Just kind of threw me like, well, I've got to try to figure out what these things are. I mean, they don't seem to conform to, established typologies, especially like thin biface technologies, Clovis and later. So, and plus they were all kind of heavily patinated, which is not necessarily 100% that they're old, but it gives you some clue that they'd been in the ground for a while. And so they were all seem to be kind of sort of uniformly patinated. So I got to.
Hey, real quick, can you explain what patinated means?
Just a kind of a chemical alteration on the surface of a chert or a stone that has been lying around for a long time, and depending on the groundwater, and various factors, it can affect the uh, chemical composition of the surface over time. And then, of course, you got sunlight and everything, excuse me, builds in there, and then it just kind of alters the surface and gives it a different color. Sometimes it gives it like a thick rind, kind of coarse rind, and that kind of thing. And
Yeah.
especially the Ocala chert, which the people down there at the Cap site and Shelley site were using, kind of gives it a chalky white rind in a lot of cases. In other cases, it's not chalky; it's just kind of a yellowish red to beige kind of color, you know, which is
Okay,
different.
so you notice some of these strange characteristics, and when I say strange, notable characteristics on the assemblage in the early 2000s, and then did you have to step away for a period of time and then return to it?
No, I mean I was kind of constantly studying the stones and the artifacts, and thinking about them over a long period of time. And I actually produced gave a series of papers and so forth, through the years at conferences and sort of continued to study. Uh, sorry. Uh, but at any rate, at some point, Al Goodyear was working on the Topper site, which you probably heard of. And I made a trip over there to see what he was finding. And I had the Clovis artifacts that I've been working with at that time and showed those to him and kind of told him about the Cap site and the Shelley sites. And he got interested. And of course, he was an early first American researcher. So he was naturally interested. So got him to come over there to the site and the sites and kind of piqued his interest. And so that kind of went on from there. He had a symposium, I think back in 2013 or 14. I can't remember the exact date, but I think it's 14 actually. But anyway, he had a symposium, and that's where I gave a paper on the CAPS technology and also some CAPS-related sites around the country. I kind of put in there also just to show that CAPS site was not an anomaly, that this technology existed in other places. Anyway, I gave that paper, and I think that kind of got his interest, and then he started putting together this book on coastal plain archaeology, and I guess he wanted me to include me in it, so I decided to go ahead and just try to work up a full-scale article, and that's kind of how that came to being as a result of that conference.
Yeah. No, great book, and of course Goodyear's done terrific research. Would love to chat with him on underground at some point too. So let's talk about the CAP site and what you discovered in the assemblage there, and what has piqued your interest. Let's get into it a bit.
Yeah, well, like I said, in order to recognize a technology such as CAPS, I think like you said earlier, it takes quite a bit of experience, because if you're just let's say you're new to archaeology, or let's say you're a navigational archaeologist, and you go out, and traditionally American archaeologists have looked for a certain thing when they go out, looking for archaeological sites or investigating archaeological sites. For example, Clovis, which is a real thin, distinctive technology, at least as far as the final end product, the Clovis point, or the blade technology associated with that, is fairly easy to recognize if you've been in, doing research for a while. Some of the bifaces, the earlier stage bifaces that go sort of into the sequence, is kind of defined by Eric Callahan, who did all of the real hard work on that as far as understanding, and then later Bruce Bradley and Mike Collins. But those types of artifacts are fairly easy to recognize, and then as you go on in time, your archaic, for example, in Alabama, you've got your Kirk and your Dalton points are fairly easy to recognize, and you go on down the line, your Morrow Mountain, your Middle Archaic, and your Savannah Late Archaic, and then you get into your Woodland, your Mud Creek points, and later on your Mississippian Triangular points. They're fairly easy to recognize for most archaeologists and for avocationals, and that's so naturally they are drawn to collecting those because they're easy to recognize. And in most cases, your flakes are the byproducts of tool manufacture that are there with the finished products, or the arrowheads or the projectile points. Those are usually ignored by avocationals, most avocationals, not all, but and then of course your archaeologists are, most of those types of sites are located during as a professional archaeologist, you're going out, you're obligated to recover pretty much everything you can. So those, the flakes and everything are collected at that point. But I guess what I'm really trying to say here is that in a lot of cases, you would go out, let's say you'd find a proverbial quarry site. In other words, a place where there's naturally occurring stone in abundance and easily accessible. You go out and you find all these broken up pieces of chert and rock, and you might find a biface fragment where a piece of stone has been picked up and worked on two different sides, or maybe on one side and abandoned. But at any rate, it's human workmanship is evident in that case. It's fairly clear. Yeah. So those are the types of things that you would find if you're on an archaeological survey normally, and but there are some sort of subtleties involved, and let me back up just here a little bit. When I first pulled the artifacts out down at UAB, University of Alabama, Birmingham, I started looking around for comparisons. Like, what are these? They don't look familiar. So I started looking around, and the only thing I could find that looked similar to them was in the old world literature, like from France and England and, places like that, where they've been doing, work for a long time on Levallois and Mysterian and, Acheulean and, things like that. So
Let me put you on pause. So, because you said Levallois, Mysterian, Acheulean. So just real quick, Levallois is a just briefly explain those three things, and then
the Levallois, is originally defined, and I'm not an old world expert, but if you read through the literature, it's a prepared core technology, meaning that it's kind of I mean, there's always controversy, and even now, as far as what the prehistoric folks were actually trying to do. But basically, as Francois Bourg, talked about it, it was basically a prepared core, and that some people call them turtleback cores or hump cores, where you shape a core on one side, and that would be set up the overall form of the core so that you could create a release surface, I believe they call it, where you would, you could remove a flake from that would be and result would be a predetermined form. In other words, if you shaped a piece of chert to be triangular shaped, then when you remove that flake, it's going to be kind of triangular shaped if you have the technical expertise to do that, and vice versa.
A very specific way of preparing a stone, which we're going to call a core. You find a block here, and you're now going to make multiple stone tools out of this piece of rock. And so you prepare the rock in such a way that it produces these flake tools or bifaces in many cases that can then be used generally as knives. Is that fair to say, or blades?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically a core and flake tool industry. And there are blade-like implements produced from Levallois-like technology. But in general, it's a pretty specific, recognizable technology. But the thing that really got me at CAPS was it's, do you have a slide available there, Mike? It's like,
yeah, which slide would you like to look at?
The first one there, showing the flaking type.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing that's really critical to anyone who might be looking to identify this technology is John Whithoff back in the 60s came up with this kind of cross-section of different flaking types. Most people are familiar with the free flaking, which is there on the upper left, which, most of your Holocene technologies use quite a bit. And you can see kind of the cross-section there of when you strike the edge of a biface and kind of how the flake kind of runs along the surface and terminates. Then you go into flat flaking and the control flat flaking, which you see quite a bit in CAPS technology, which means that basically when you strike the edge of a piece of raw material like a core, oftentimes the sheer amount of force will take that flake all the way across the face of the core and off the other side. So you can kind of see in that middle control flat flaking how it just kind of goes all the way across. It's kind of akin to overshot flaking. There you see on the lower left, in which case you strike it and it goes across flat, and then it kind of disappears, and in some cases even removes the edge of the piece on the opposite end from where it was struck. Uh-huh. But in an ideal situation, it would not do that. It would just kind of feather out, across that opposing edge there. But you can see the different types of flaking. But critical to recognizing this technology is understanding how that. And I don't understand how they did it, but when they struck the core to remove the flakes, they were oftentimes, instead of a point like you would, for example, in Clovis, they would often grind the platforms and produce a specific specific point where they would strike it with a antler baton and remove that overshot flake or just a thinning flake. However, in CAPS technology, it seems to be more of an area they were actually hitting. I'm thinking more of a hammerstone of some type. In other words, a broad area impact, and it's almost like a shear. It's almost like they're shearing the flakes. Now obviously, when you're in a quarry site location and you have initial reduction of cobbles, you're going to get some overlap with some of this. These are not strict flaking types. I think these are kind of idealized, but when you start looking at CAPS technology, not just from the standpoint of when you're initially reducing something, but you're actually trying to make flakes from these cores in a Levallois-like manner, then you're talking about a great deal of control and a great deal of strength to be able to do that.
Hmm.
Uh, so, so anyway, it's critical, to look at the way the flakes are removed from the core, and then also it's critical to look at what they're actually producing. And in level Y, you get different types, shapes of flakes. You get amorphous, you get the triangular, you get the oval. Depending on the shape of the core, you get the blade. So, but one thing they have in common though is if you can try to, if you're able to find the cores. Okay, well it's a good example there of the flat flaking I'm talking about on the upper part of the implement. There you can see it almost looks like it's been sheared all the way across, and
Yeah.
then
Yep.
and then and in some cases on the ends of some of these things, like that one there, almost looks like they could have struck it at the tip, sort of like in a burin-like fashion. I do have some pretty good examples of burins on the ends of these things. So but again, it's a broad type of flaking using a broad platform, and somehow they're able to control it so that it goes all the way across, but it doesn't dig too deeply into the tool. It doesn't damage the tool. It ends up with some type of implement that they're actually using. Uh,
So it's a very specific, so there's two things going on here. There's a very specific way in which they are manufacturing the tool, and it is different from what we see in other techno-complexes in North America. And then secondly, the tools themselves, the product is significantly different from what we're seeing in many cases. To me, it's I hate to use the word crude, but that term is used. We're talking about refined versus a some somewhat more crude flaking technique. And so it's perhaps a bit more expeditiously made. Maybe they're considered uh, more disposable than some of the other tool types. Would that be fair to say?
uh, well, Mike, there's a whole lot we don't understand about the technology, but uh, one thing at the caps and shell, especially at the cap site, I mean, it's clear that not only are they procuring material there, in other words, they're finding material there to use to manufacture the tools. The nodules actually occur at the site, but they're also creating a fairly wide range of tools for use. So, in other words, they were coming there, it appears, and procuring or finding material, making their tools, and actually using them there. So they were actually living there for a while. It's not like it was just they come, got the material, and made some tools, and obviously the tools are still there. They didn't remove them and take them somewhere else. So, uh,
Yeah.
so that has implications for what they were actually doing at the site.
Yeah, longer term occupation. That's interesting too. You mentioned Mousterian and Schulian, some old world technologies. Do you see that same kind of variety of tool types at single sites to indicate long
Maybe
term
get
use?
maybe get that next slide. Yeah, this is what they would call similar to a hand axe in the old world, and we've had people in this country, at different sites. For example, out at Black Fork in Wyoming and Lake Mannix out in California, and different places where people claim they found these hand axe-like implements, in old terraces and so forth. We have an abundance of raw material. And of course, you've got the classic, William Holmes up in the Northeast, I believe New Jersey, where that he found all these bifaces at a quarry up there, and kind of been controversial as whether or not they're all just represent a stage in manufacture of say a thin biface, or whether it could be older, you know, something like that. But anyway, these type of implements like you have on the screen now are they're fairly common at the cap site, and they show kind of a you know I wouldn't. This one here is kind of hard. It looks like it's probably a little bit of flat flaking and maybe even some free flaking. But when get back to your terminology, kind of most people would probably refer to it as some type of crude tool or implement. Uh,
One of the things though, I kind of want to, I think it's worth sort of cutting to the chase here a little bit just to provide some context for how interesting this is, because we're talking about Levallois and we've already mentioned Mousterian, but a lot of folks don't really, might not really understand what those tools are often associated with, and I'll just drop it into the conversation that this technique is used during the middle Paleolithic and seems to fall out of favor generally between 40 and 50,000 years ago in the old world, although I think it can carry on a little bit later. But it's most often associated, not exclusively, but most often associated with Neanderthal populations. Is that fair to say?
yes, in the old world, yes.
Yeah, I mean, so and then when I see this hand axe, it just with my educational background in this subject, if you say this is a Levallois manufactured hand axe and you show me this picture, I'm thinking, oh, that looks like a Neanderthal hand axe you might find in France. you know, so what in the world is it doing in Alabama?
Oh, yeah, well, like I say, it's establishing any kind of relationship between old and new world, of course, has to be done very carefully, and that's why when I wrote the article, I made no claims of any kind of association, and I still make no claims. Uh, what, but what I had to do though, once I saw the artifacts, I had to try to come up with an explanation for them, and I'm still trying to do that. So, uh, don't draw any conclusions regarding, any affiliation, any association with the old world and new world technologies here in this regard. But at the same time, don't ignore the resemblance. Don't ignore the fact that there are things here that have to be explained and not ignored. And I think one of the issues here, a main issue, is the framework from which you are trying to interpret what you're finding. If you go out, I think you and I discussed that before. If you have a certain concept of what you're going to find, and probably that's all you're going to find. But if you have a little bit more of an open mind uh, perspective, then you might find some things that require explaining. Like I think CAPS technology requires explaining, and maybe if you have a little more of an open mind, then maybe if you start explore it a little more, then maybe there'll be a little more understanding creep in, or there's always a danger of you know of trying to and that's the reason I haven't really made any claims, is because we don't really know. We haven't been able to date these artifacts. And one thing is that we got an advantage here. I don't think anybody can dispute these are artifacts. We have a lot of controversy where people find things over here, and there's a lot of controversy regarding whether or not they're even artifacts. However, if again, that gets back to your perspective and your ability to keep an open mind, because if you go over to the old world and you find some of the artifacts that have been found over here, for example, down in Mexico at what's the name of that cave, Chiquita or something, in northern Mexico, Cyprian RGN drug. A lot of people think those aren't artifacts, but if you look at them really closely, and granted they've got a lot of weathering on them, but I looked at them pretty closely and I think they're artifacts. At least maybe not all of them, but the majority of them. And but it takes a different perspective. And if you're just looking for a certain type of technology, for example, a thin biface technology, Clovis on, then you're not going to recognize them as artifacts.
Yeah.
You're just simply not.
I mean, I would imagine that somebody would argue, oh, this is a a preform. There's problems with trying to do that. We could say it's a preform or a blank. It's unrefined. It may have been transported with the intent of refining it at another point in time into something that's more familiar within the sort of tool chronology that we have. But I think what the problem with that interpretation is the fact that typically Levallois was not used. I mean, unless tell me differently, but Clovis and the various tool technologies that seem to have descended from it did not use the Levallois preparation in their initial stages. Is that correct?
No, I mean, like I said, the archaeological record that I'm familiar with in North America, doesn't contain a Levallois type technology. There is, of course, out west, Guy Muto found, evidence of what he called Levallois out there, but more of a blade-like Levallois. And I think in, some of the stem tradition stuff over there, they found some linear material that the blades were removed in a Levallois-like manner. But other than that, which is really different from what we've got over here with caps, you're getting the whole range of flake types. So yeah, it doesn't show up that I'm aware of, and also there's no evidence of heat treatment or really pressure flaking, which is commonly associated with your Holocene cultures, which is another technological distinction for caps technology.
I'm sorry. Can you repeat that last bit about the Holocene? I missed that.
What is that?
Repeat that last statement you made. I didn't hear it.
Just when you look at the North American archaeological record and you start looking at sites that have traditional Clovis and later components or occupations, you generally don't see. You generally occasionally see heat treatment of chert or bare silica materials. You also see pressure flaking as a finishing technique on projectile points and other tools, retouch. In other words, instead of using a hard hammer percussion with a lot of force, you use a sort of a gentle pressure motion to gradually release the flake from the surface of the artifact. So you generally don't see that at all in caps technology, either heat treatment or that type of flaking. So that's another function.
People who aren't familiar, I just mentioned, my understanding, relatively rudimentary understanding of thermal alteration appears in the early Holocene. So if you have a huge assemblage of material that it has no thermal alteration at all, it might suggest that it's paleolithic. It doesn't necessarily have to be, but if it was heat treated, then we would assume that it's Holocene period.
Well,
but none of this is heat treated, so therefore it could date to the Pleistocene.
Yeah. So in general, I mean, from what I've seen, looking around the country and communicating with other people that have found artifacts around the country, right now, we've got a number of different locations, where it appears to have a similar technology, which is another thing I think that you have to look for when you're trying to understand this is that if you find something at one site, or in this case, two sites for caps and Shelley sites in southeast Alabama, that would be one thing. You say, okay, well, there's there are quarry pits at the Shelley site, which is another thing that probably need to be investigated. Those are huge quarry pits, and there's probably potential for them to be dated at some point. If you had the permission to go out there and dig trenches and so forth, you might be able to come up with something. But at any rate, I think that there's a lot of research that could continue to be done on these sites potentially to try to date the artifacts, which is our biggest stumbling block now. We don't have any dates. People have tried to. We did a small testing project out at the CAP site not too long ago, a couple of years ago, to try to see if we could find something to date with optically stimulated luminescence or radiocarbon, soil samples, that kind of thing. But we couldn't really come up with anything. The site appears to be just contained all in the plow zone at the CAP site. So, in other words, dating the artifacts is obviously critical here to establish any time frame, any relationship with old world, that kind of thing. People, you know, when people were migrating over here to this uh, to the Americas. So that's something that's really outstanding that needs to be done. And trying to date the artifacts directly, people try to do that through different. Barbara Purdy down in Florida back in the '70s. She tried to do some electron work, spectroscopy, I believe, and tried to figure out. I don't think she actually came up with some ages, which I can't. Seemed like it was like 30, 40,000 years or something, but there's a lot of controversy around that. And then when you look into
let me put you on pause just for a second, Blaine, because that's interesting what you just said. So, because I met Barbara Purdy, of course, I'm here in Florida, and she has a terrific reputation. She deceased recently. Uh, so she had this site outside of Gainesville called the Container Site, just colloquially, I think it has a different name, but Container Site. And that was the first time I had ever heard reported Levallois technique being found. And I haven't read the technical report, but I remember there was something interesting about the sedimentation there. It was like buried in clays or something, which was a little bit unconventional. But I don't know enough about that to discuss it. But you just said that she had come up with some dates that were controversial. But those dates were somewhere in the 30 to 40,000 year range. Is that what
like
you
I
said?
said, I'm just my memory from a long time ago. That's what I remember. I may not be accurate, but
Sure.
based on that, on the study of the patination, process of the Ocala chert down there, I think she may have come up with
Okay.
something
Wow.
like that.
That,
But
that's that's
it's
all.
yeah. But
Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to get you off track, but you were talking about other kinds of sites that have yielded similar type materials.
yeah, and the more I examine, and I've examined probably 3 or 4 different collections, samples of different collections firsthand, others by photographs, and I think it's kind of undeniable that there's this level wildlife technology kind of spread across across North America, and we had some guys back in the '70s, up at the Timlin site up in New York, and they claim they found these level wildlife technology, down in the Pleistocene Terrace, or Till and so forth. And of course, I got shot down immediately by the archaeologists up there. Uh, but at any rate, if you go to their publication, you can actually see some photographs of what they found up there, and that feels very similar to what we've got here at the CAP site. Uh, and these other collections, we've got them in Georgia. We got 2 different locations in Georgia. We got Tennessee. Uh, we got out in Arizona. We got Nevada. We got up north, site there, and just over the border in Canada on the island out there. Man, I can't forget the name of it. It starts with an M. But anyway, we've got a number of different
Let me ask you
locations.
this: that's a bunch of sites you just rattled off, and
Yeah.
it's fascinating to think there's this sort of shadow tool technology that's almost ubiquitous, and yet nobody seems to be talking about this. You and Barbara Purdy are the only 2 people who I've ever are sort of aware of having involvement with this particular technology. But are there other people out there that are looking into this question?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, you have people obviously looking for I mean, I'm not that familiar with the South American work because you have people down there working that are familiar with old world archaeology, and some of them are from the old world, and they're working down there, and I think they are looking for it. Uh, but up here in North America, not so much. I think, and you know, I think you had mentioned at one point you were asked me, if I'd had any much feedback from any of this research, and of course the answer is no, because I think most people kind of shy away from it because it is, like you say, controversial, and they just don't want to. And maybe they legitimately don't see anything worth talking about. That's fair. But you know, but at any rate, they it is a controversial topic, and but at the same time, the more I look at it, I can't ignore it. And when I keep finding things, people that have found these that are very similar, and I'm like, all I can do when I try to figure out what the stuff is to go to overall resources and publications and say, oh yeah, there's that, there's this, and but over here, like you say, you look at the Holocene archaeological record and the Clovis, you can't really find much that's very similar. Now obviously in the Clovis, you get the more of the upper Paleolithic, the blade technology coming in there. So in terms of the flaking types like overshot, you see a little more similarity. But when you start getting past Clovis, uh, and you just really don't see really hardly anything you could really say is anywhere near related to what we're seeing at Caps. And even in Clovis, you don't see the level wall.
Let me ask you this, and then we can kind of get into the implications. This is a little bit more of a technical question. But when you were comparing it to some of the old world site assemblages, do you see that you're talking about a variety of different types of tools found at Caps and Shelley? So you've mentioned burins, hand axes. We've got some blades. You've got a variety of different things. Do you see in any of the assemblages in the old world a similar distribution of the tool type variety that you're seeing at Caps and Shelley?
Yeah, I mean, there's a wide variety. Do we have another slide there?
Sure. Which one?
Next one, I guess, is okay. Yeah, these are cores, Caps technology cores, showing prepared cores there, and then the and the one on the left there, the nowhere they call that a preferential flake removal, where you prepare the lateral margins of the core and then produce or remove a central flake. Same for the one on the right there. It's kind of harder. It's a little bit harder to see, but you can see where they trimmed around the edges, and then almost a blade-like removal going across the whole surface of the core. And then the two on the bottom are, you can see the preparation shape of the core, and then they remove the flake. You can see it's kind of rectangular. You can see the facets, almost facet appearance, where they had shaped the core. Now, then, give me another slide there. We'll look at the flake. These are some of the flake products from the cores. You can see kind of a triangular shape. In some cases, a little amorphous. Okay, next slide. You can see the ventral side of those same flakes.
Uh-huh.
If you look at them really closely, you can see why, yes, they do look similar to, if you're walking out in a plowed field, you look down and you see flakes. But there, if you look a little closer, you can see in the middle row there on the left, you can see almost a faceted like point coming to a point up on the right. And again, it gets back to the way they were removing these flakes, and it's more of a controlled flat flaking and a sheared, where you don't get a lot of feathering like you do in later technologies for the terminations. You get more of an abrupt end and a facet produced oftentimes. And there's overlap, obviously, but in general, and also you get the way the cores are struck is oftentimes, instead of in a lot of your Holocene technologies, the when you strike a flake, the bow of percussion and the end of the flake will be pretty much on the same axis. In other words, it'll be pretty straight. But on a lot of your Caps technology flakes, you'll hit the core, and the way the core is shaped will cause that flake to twist and turn, or dog leg, to one side or the other. So you get kind of asymmetric flakes produced because of the shape of the core. So that's another thing to look for when you're if you're trying to find CAPS technology, is that there'll be probably a fair number of those type of flakes that don't conform to your traditional, you know, thin flake that terminates.
You should teach this in grad school because, yeah, no, I mean, some of these materials, like you said, I've found hundreds or thousands of flakes that I never even considered looking at those types of characteristics in the analysis. So it's
Yeah, I've been kind of helped here by the fact that these are all pretty much the same patination,
yeah.
and the fact that there's been virtually nothing else found that I'm aware of at this site other than these patinated stuff. Now, we did go out during the testing. We did find one little fragment of a heated thin biface in one of the units. So there is, I mean, obviously, when you got a site exposed that long in raw material, you're going to have some later stuff there. But, in general, and I'd say probably 95, 99% of the stuff's going to be this CAPS technology there at CAPS site. Now, the Shelley site does have later material on it. It's got heated material. But again, you're at a quarry site. You're going to have stuff there. But so I've been kind of lucky in the sense I've been able to kind of narrow it down with some help there. But to use an example from Southwest Georgia, where the guys found this coral. You're probably familiar with the coral down there in Florida, and some of the agate-looking material. This guy's got this technology on that material, so it's not patinated at all. So it depends on where you find it. But the technology, when you understand what it is, then it's just like, I guess it'd be kind of like going over to the old world, studying there, the Wawa technology over there. And you know what it looks like once you find it. You find it in a lot of different places in the old world. And I imagine if you come over here and start looking at this technology, you would have to at least admit that there's some semblance of similarity.
Well, again, back to the question, if we're looking at a hand axe. Okay, here's a hand axe, and it looks like a hand axe from the old world. But are you also seeing in the other tools that are being manufactured? And it sounds like you're seeing it in the flakes. But the correlation is greater than just the use of Lavawa and the making of hand axes. There are other tools in the assemblage which also seem to correlate. Is that safe to say?
Yeah. There's a wide range of tools. There are picks, for example, elongated picks. The scrapers, different types of scrapers, smaller bifaces that are thick, not thin bifaces. They don't appear to be intermediate in, for example, manufacturing projectile point, but they appear to be finished tools, small handheld bifaces. So yeah, there's a range of tools that would fit in over there. Sure.
Yeah. No, I mean that's where it gets interesting. It does run the risk of backing us into a corner, insofar as explaining, whether we can get into independent invention here in a little bit, but that's fascinating. All right. Well, thank you. You mentioned some of the outre passé or overshot flaking, which of course is a sort of well, I don't want to call it common. It's an attribute that we see in Clovis. We also see that in some other old world technologies as well. Of course, famously in Solutrean. So, are you? Does the sort of the possibility of Solutrean influence play into this discussion at all?
Well, we found a few things that appear, similar. I guess that's the best term I could come up with. Thin biface that are tapered. You might want to move that slide forward one. We'll go to that's another example of your CAPS technology end products. Just, I kind of shied away from making functional interpretations. It's really hard to see where on the edges of these tools because of the patination. But, some people in the old world call these points, or some of them call them scrapers. It's just, I kind of avoided a typological approach because we really don't understand what these are, you know.
Well, that's interesting because I do see what somebody might call a single shoulder on some of these examples, which is a hallmark of Solutrean. And for those people out there who don't know what Solutrean is, it's an old world tool type that shows up primarily in the Iberian Peninsula, and it has been said that there are some similarities between Solutrean and Clovis. There's some problems, of course, chronologically, among others, among the fact that there's a giant ocean in between the two continents. Um, but uh, but it's a strong, in my opinion, it's a strong argument for Clovis progenitor. So looking at this, um, and these are a little bit more refined, I would say. I mean, they're not, you don't see a lot of pressure flaking around the edges, and sort of there's a late stage refinement. But they do you see tools like this in Solutrean assemblages?
No, this is CAPS technology here.
Okay.
We got the next slide, I believe, shows the things that are kind of. But before you, could you go back to that slide real quick?
Sure.
One thing I forgot to mention is, in addition to your kind of what we call corner struck flakes on cores, where the point of impact is at one place, and then the force kind of bends to the shape of the core. But on a lot of your flakes, I mean, a lot of your the flakes that are produced, you'll see what we call side struck flakes, meaning, for example, this one here. And I was having a hard time initially figuring out. I couldn't understand based on traditional interpretations of North American flaking technologies. Is if you see this a pointed object like that, you say, well, some kind of projectile point, some kind of point, and you would think, okay, well, if they're going to produce a flake blank, or in other words, a piece of raw material, they're going to make that point on, they would the bulb of percussion would be at one end, and they would terminate it about where the point is, the axis of percussion, where that force ran along the raw material. And so I kept looking for that on this material, but the thing is, they were the way they were producing these flakes to make their tools on, they were actually hitting it from the side. So when one on the bottom, in the middle there, you can see a kind of a ventral, what we call a ventral surface, is flat and smooth, but and you can see kind of where it looks like it's been retouched on the left, but that's actually where they had struck it from the side, and so that flake came off a lot wider than it is long. So they were actually using that type of flake, which can be really confusing if you're not used to looking at that.
It's also, I don't know a whole lot about, the dynamics of napping techniques, but striking something from the side seems like it's a risky proposition. you know,
Yeah.
you got
Yeah,
to know
well,
what you're doing.
yeah, you have to really know what you're doing, and that's the thing that really got me about this technology. Is this is something that it's taken hundreds of thousands of years probably to develop.
Well, that's interesting. Well, wait, so expound on that a little bit. You think that this technology has, clearly has a long tradition to it.
Yeah, I don't think there's any
Sorry,
doubt.
expound, please.
I don't think there's any doubt about that, because if you look at the way that some of the end products of these tools, and as a modern napper, I mean, I'm not an expert napper. I've done napping, in the past, and so I'm basically familiar with, how flint or chert fractures and so forth. But from my repertoire of knowledge, I had a hard time figuring out how they could produce something like this. You
All
know,
right, well, that's interesting too, because we don't know much about this technology, the manufacturing technique, and there doesn't seem to be an early sort of developmental series of technologies that led to this. There's no antecedents. This is kind of like the Clovis problem all over again. We don't see a progenitor immediately uh, obvious in the Western Hemisphere.
not in the Western. No, we do in the old world, but not here. Uh, so, but the next slide shows what you were referring to, possible, again, you're getting your tapered. All these seem to be fractured, probably during use. Maybe these things were hafted, so they all seem to be fractured along the same plane. Some of them are a little thicker than others. The one on the lower right there, that's kind of a, kind of anomalous. Then the reason I put it in that slide is because it's a thin biface as opposed to the other bifaces at the side. And it kind of seems to go more along with the, I'm not going to call them Salutrian-like, but if you look in the old world, it's the closest thing we'd have, at the Camp Shelley site. So anything like that.
And that has overshot flaking.
Some of those, I believe some of those had some flaking on them that went pretty much all the way across, but I can't really tell from here. But it's,
Well,
again, it's a very small minority. I mean, you're talking, most of these are from the Shelley site, not the Cap site.
so what is that something that we see in the old world as well with Lavallois technique, where you've got the larger sort of Mousterian, Neanderthal tool types, and they tend to have a triangular look, and that long sort of dorsal ridge, and then but they're thicker. Uh, do we see over there occasional examples of thinner biface manufacture?
I mean, I'm not that familiar with how thin the bifaces go over there, but my guess is
Okay.
they're probably, not quite as thin as some of your Clovis and archaic thin bifaces over here. Although obviously you get some well-made Mysterian bifaces.
Okay. All right. Very, very interesting. All right. Well, that's a great summary of the site and the tools. And it's fascinating to me, and that some of the similar examples are elsewhere. So I know you've been sort of cautious to speculate too much. I appreciate that. It's smart and scientific. Uh, if you were to, do you want to make a guess as to who could have made these tools and when? I mean, what do you have a gut sense on that, or you just want to hold off on going down that road too much?
Well, one thing I would say is that when we look at the peopling of the Americas, or whatever you want to refer to it as, searching for the earliest Americans, notwithstanding the Native Americans, who obviously have been here for a very, very, very long time. Uh, you have to look, I think, especially given some of the information we're getting now regarding other places in the world where people are being, documented cases where people were moving around, using watercraft. In other words, we're talking about access to the continent, basically. And I think like Michael Collins said, I mean, we're looking at a process, not an event. We're looking at numerous, and I'm not really that up to date with the DNA evidence. I know they have some things going on in South America and different places, and as far as trying to correlate DNA information with your archaeological data, which I think is critical. Uh, I think ultimately we have to explain what we're finding over here from an archaeological material culture standpoint. While DNA is obviously a valuable tool, but we have to really be able to correlate those things. But anyway, I'm thinking we're looking at probably multiple movements of people, and as far as getting back to the DNA, I mean, as far as any DNA links, I mean, obviously our record is limited in terms of what we have for available and how far back that goes. So, for example, if we had let's say a real early, hypothetically early migration somehow, and maybe those people didn't survive. Maybe
Michael,
maybe they died out somehow. Then maybe we had another group of people. But that goes along with what you're saying about Salutrian and what Dennis Stanford and then we're saying is that people. What if people did come over, like the Vikings or somebody came over for a while, and then they went back, or they didn't, they died out. The few people that made it or something. We just don't know, and I think so. I guess to get to the crux of your question, I don't know. All I know is what I see in the technology, and I see some relationships possibly with the old world. And if you look at the time frame, it fits in pretty good with the Middle Paleolithic. Uh,
Well, so you feel with some degree of confidence that these are pre-Clovis or certainly Pleistocene period materials.
well, without any dates, see, I can't be even sure they're pre-Clovis, you know. But all I can do from a typological standpoint, I can certainly look most close to, for example, the Wawa, over in northern Africa, or someplace in the old world. I can say that, but I don't know when they date to.
Do you have just to the container site and Barbara Purdy's work back in the 70s? And forgive me, I should have dug into this a little bit before we spoke. Do you happen to remember the matrix in which they were found, or the stratigraphic setting, and whether or not that spoke um, to a period of deposition?
I mean, I visited the site, and there's sandy clay matrix at the bottom of the site. It has a sheet of sand over it, basically. And she was finding these artifacts in that sandy clay, and we examined, a fair number of those artifacts. There were, I forget how many were at the conference, and I think everyone in general came to the agreement that, as far as them actually being artifacts, that were probably 90% certain, but there needed to be a little more done in terms of replication and I'm sorry, experimentation with the local church and how it naturally fractures and what types of fractures it can produce. It might mimic some of the things we were seeing on the art of the objects that were probably artifacts. So yeah, about 90%. If you look at them, I mean, to me, I could see definite hints to Cap's technology in those in terms of the faceting and the way they would have come off of a core. But her artifacts were, I mean, sorry, her objects or her pieces of chert were very reminiscent of the technology, the Cap technology. They were heavily patinated, so it made it really difficult to see flake scars and so forth. So that's kind of where we left it. I think she was going to go back and maybe try to secure some dates from the top of the sandy clay, uh, and then maybe try to do some experimentations to kind of validate what we were thinking, that probably these were tools.
Well, one of the things I can tell you as an archaeologist who's dug thousands of shovel tests and excavation units in Florida,
Wow.
where the container site was
Yeah,
found, um, we almost always terminate the dig when we encounter clay. It's just assumed that we are now getting into sterile soils, and it's too early to find any human material. So um, I've and I think with Al Goodyear's work at Topper, it's another example of sort of a general statement, which is that we may not be digging deep enough, as a general rule, certainly on the compliance side of archaeology.
sure. Well, I think it's my understanding. I don't have this firsthand, but it's my understanding there are some people out there now that are actually doing the geology work first, and then going out and looking for Pleistocene deposits where artifacts could remain in place. In other words, instead of the old approach, going out digging shovel tests and coring and whatnot, and then stopping at a certain point. And the same applies to rock shelters and caves. I mean, if you've got things that are really old, over time, you've got earthquakes, you've got rock falling, you've got things that are going to be burying these sites really deeply if they're there. So, unless you know where to look, and what to look for, then you're probably not.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Texas has been good about that, and some other states. You're right. There is more geomorphological work that's being done, and heavy equipment, particularly at water crossings where there could be heavy sedimentation. But I just as I it we are operating. This might be a discussion worth having now. We're operating with a preset sort of list of ideas of constraints um, that has built sort of an interpretive framework. When we go into to do a dig, we something as simple as, hey, if you hit clay, terminate the shovel test because there's no chance for there to be anthropogenic materials in the clay. Like we it might be time to start questioning some of those assumptions.
Yeah, we definitely need to look harder and look in the right places and keep an open mind where the things might lie. Now, one thing I'll note is that there seems to be some sort of correlation between where we're finding this CAPS technology and the occurrence of raw material. In other words, there seems to be an abundance of raw material wherever we're finding the technology, which is probably not coincidental, and because a lot of these sources have been exposed for a long period of would have been exposed for a long period of time. So that's one thing you have to have that, at least initially. You have to have the possibility of this technology being old, because if it's a really old surface like down at the cap side, the top of an Eocene ridge, you know, with Holocene deposits mainly eroded off when the land was cleared. I mean, you've got to at least have that possibility of these landforms and things being old in order to entertain the idea of the artifacts being old, obviously.
Yeah.
So, but there does seem to be a co-occurrence. And then, when you look in the old world, I was taken with that article published somewhere about the stone tool pavement over in the Sahara. I don't know if you heard about that, or the people, they found all this raw sandstone outcrop over there in the middle of the desert, and they're out there digging these little test pits, and they're finding all these tools and things in the test pits, and they're just going for kilometers and kilometers, and they estimated how many tools have been produced over hundreds of thousands of years in the Paleolithic, and it's like some unbelievable number. And I got to thinking about that, and I'm like, well, it kind of makes sense after we started talking about it, because that's one thing I think even me as an archaeologist has a hard time grasping is time depth. I mean, if you're talking hundreds of thousands, even million years, when somebody was walking around making tools, it's mind-boggling how much can be accumulated,
Yeah.
depending on
Yeah.
what they're doing, obviously. So that's one thing I've noticed over here. I mean, this technology does seem to be associated with where you've got an abundance of raw material, and there seems to be a lot of, these artifacts. So I think I don't know what the implications are there. To me, it's just something that has to be explained. And I think the way we do that is by not being afraid to be wrong, number one, because and making all the information public. If you find something, make it public. Because if everybody's invested in understanding what's going on, and don't be afraid to be wrong. I mean, if somebody comes out to the CAP site tomorrow and dates one, CAP's technology, 8,000 years ago, I'm fine with it. I just want to know what it is, and how long it's been there.
Yeah.
I don't make any, because I can't make any great claims because I don't have any great proof. You know.
Yeah. Well, it would. Seeing as how there's very little evidence for a progenitor, even an 8,000-year-old date would be interesting. you know, okay, it's here then. Where was it before? So Michael Fott, we interviewed, and he has a terrific theory, which is a dual origins theory for Native American for Amerins or Paleo Americans. And he correlates the genetic data with the archaeological data. And the genetic data, he argues, again, dual orders. One group coming, he calls them Eurasians. So these are, DNA originally from somewhere in the Lake Baikal area. They migrated over to Western Europe, and this would be the Solutrean coming in. And then there's another population somewhere around Taiwan, according to the DNA, and they come over. He believes trans-Pacific, mostly into South America, and he correlates again so that some of the artifacts you see in Monte Verde with some of the sites that they have out in Southeastern Asia. So when looking at, obviously we're talking about the similarities between, caps and some of the Middle Paleolithic in Europe and so on. Is there anything in the Far East, China, Japan, Taiwan, Siberia that looks like what you've got at Caps and Shelley
Yeah, in Siberia, yeah.
in Siberia?
Yeah, I mean, there's a Russian, I forget his name, he's published Paleolithic of Siberia, I believe is the name of the book. Yeah, he's got textbook Wawa in there, you know.
Okay. Well, that's so that that might be, there's an argument for an antecedent here potentially to this technology. It's um, if it does indeed come over from the old world and wasn't independently invented, because it's either coming over through Beringia or the Neanderthals, or possibly a Homo sapiens sapien um, uh, culture using Levallois was getting pretty clever with watercraft.
Yeah, well, that's one thing, Mike, that, it's kind of struck me is that, when you try to keep up with what goes on in the old world in terms of Paleolithic discoveries, uh, all you got to do is check the news. We're finding something seems like every week that pushes, you know, the age range is back. Whether it be Homo sapiens and when they left Africa, or Homo erectus, or you know Homo habilis, or Denisovans, or they're pushing the dates back and the distributions of, for example, the Wawa technology, the ages of that, and the thing that was initially recognized and named in France, you know, is just now become a term, and it's kind of, I don't say misleading, but it's a kind of a catch-all term, because what they're really talking about is a specific core type where you release have one or two, you have a release surface, and there are different technologies that over a wide expanse that produce that. So, and a lot of people think it's just because they were doing it and maybe independently invented it, because it was just a very efficient technology to produce these tools that they really needed, to survive. So, there are arguments both ways for that, independent invention or diffusion or whatnot. But I guess what it's got me thinking, though, is that we got all this wide distribution in the old world, but we got this whole, landmass over here we call the Americas, and we say it's not over here. And it's, when we had the conference at the Paleo American conference back over in Santa Fe, and we had some people from the old world come up there, and they were looking at the slides we produced, and they said, "Oh yeah, we find these all the time over there."
Well, I mean that's
I'm
clear
like,
argument.
"Oh, okay, I'll take your word for it." I'm not over there, I haven't seen them, you know, but yeah, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if we had the technology that spread over here, you know.
I mean, it's a clear, it gets again when you have a variety of tool types within a given assemblage, and you're seeing them in different parts of the world. It's either Carl Jung and is spot on, and we have some sort of collective unconscious, and we're able to make very similar tool types across vast distances, or there's diffusion, which I tend to lean towards. So no, it's fascinating. Of course, the mechanism of it, when and how, is yet to be understood. You talk a bit about the sort of epistemological aspects of this, and do you think that it's just simply the case that these materials are being encountered, that they by either consultants or in university projects, but they're being misclassified and interpreted, and that it's just a matter of sort of priming the next generation of archaeologists to think about these sites a little differently?
I think that could be one component of it. I mean, I think recognition obviously can be, if you're not fairly well versed in what you're looking for, then yes, that can be a component. I think it's also the fact that a lot of these landforms and the way they're investigated currently, you're just not finding the right land surface, the right soil to look in, uh, because of, like you say, you quit digging when you reach clay, and you don't do a lot of deep probing, and let's face it, you're faced with a cost of budget when you're doing cultural resource management. You don't have unlimited funds to look for things that are 20 meters deep. But so yeah, I think it's kind of a mixed bag of why, but I definitely think recognition is, and I think probably one thing that probably needs to happen. Like I say, I'm pretty much self-trained. There wasn't even anybody who really, had worked with lithic or stone tools when I started out at the University of Alabama. So, and I'm not sure, you have some professors here in this country that work in the old world. They're familiar with old world technology, but for understandable reasons, they don't want to start talking about this. But I think it might be, beneficial for more programs to have, that offer, stone tool studies, maybe require a course overseas at some of the institutes to study, or maybe bring collections back over to study here, but to, become more familiar with that technology, because unless you are, you're not going to, it's going to be very difficult for you to recognize it. And, even if you collect it and you bring it back into the lab, you may not recognize it then. So,
Well, I'm embarrassed to say that some of the images we looked at, if I had been confronted with them, my immediate interpretation would be that's a scraper or an adze. And I never would have considered it's a core for a Laval, stone tool manufacturer. So it's yeah, I do think I think it's what's critical is to get your research out there and to get people aware of it and thinking about it. And then I think it's possible that that a small floodgate might open, because if you're finding these as broadly speaking as ubiquitous as you've described previously, then we are missing this not because they're not there, but because we're not approaching them with the right interpretive framework.
yeah, well, I think, like I say, I think to me, it's a matter of intellectual growth and, you know, not being afraid to be wrong, because, when you had the Calico Hill site being dug back in the 60s, and you had Louis Leakey come over, and eventually Francois Board, and, these old world specialists, and said, oh, yeah, these were tools. And of course, immediately got rejected, and I think still rejected for the most part. But, until you can get people not, willing to kind of explore this more and say, okay, well, it is, if we would be making an extraordinary claim, if we were saying these are paleolithic tools. But on the other hand, we can't ignore what's there, so we have to come up with some other alternative explanation. I think dating is critical here. I mean, if we could figure out how to date these patented tools, if we could find them in place where we could date the landform, uh, find radiocarbon, at least get a minimum age on them. I mean, we could go a long ways there. I think to opening the door to people getting serious about looking and studying these things. I mean, if we've got collections now that are in people's private hands that need some lithic specialist, stone tool specialist to go look at and say, okay, I either concur with what you're saying about CAPS technology, or we think you're completely off base. We need people to go out and examine these collections and do a real analysis on them. I mean, I'm talking an old world analysis or a new world analysis, whatever you want to call it, but using strict, lithic training and you know, just our knowledge that we've accumulated and understanding how the prehistoric people produced all of these stone tools. We need to bring all that evidence to bear, and then just look at these and say, what is this? I mean, is this a level wall-like core? Is it a level wall-like flake? Is it a hand axe looking biface? Is it a, you know, a blade that could have been produced during the Mysterium. I mean, we need people to put their hands on it and their eyes on it.
We need some graduate students who are going to lean into this. So if any graduate student is out there listening and you're looking for a good thesis or dissertation topic, get in touch with me or Blaine, because this is amazing. And like you said, the access to the tools that are in those private collections. I know you've mentioned in the past that they're a little hard to get to look at, but that would be critical too. I mean, that's an incredible dissertation topic in my opinion.
Yeah,
No,
I mean, that would be a really good topic for someone to take the known existing collections, if you could get access to them, and just say, okay, are these similar across a wide area and across North America? Are they not similar? If they are similar, what does the technology most closely represent? Is it an unknown technology, or is it something that we could fit in an existing typology or technology? I mean, that would be a great topic.
yeah, yeah, no, it's fascinating. So let's say there's a benevolent billionaire knocking on your door and wants to do some additional work on CAPS technology. What would you recommend doing as next steps, Blaine?
Well, I mean, I mean, like I said, we need more dating. We need to develop dating techniques where we can directly date artifacts. So, I mean, I would recommend doing, if you had the money, you could do some more research into that. Maybe it would be be a lot more. If you could develop the technique, it would be a lot more cost effective than trying to go out and find, in the field, finding things you could date. But short of that, I mean, we've got a virtually unexplored cap site. I mean, there's a large area out there that's unexplored, even though we think it's probably primarily a surface site. I mean, you could probably go out there and conduct some more testing and make sure that it's all plow zone, and mechanically remove the plow zone and look for features. You might find something datable. We just don't know how old, how long it's been a plow zone, how long there could be any features preserved. It's been plowed over the years. Features could be plowed out. We just don't know. But that would be one possibility. Over at the Shelley side, I mean, those quarry pits. I mean, there's mounds where they dug those things out beside the pit. So I mean, you could trench those mounds and look in the bottom of the mounds where would be the earliest stuff came out of the pits.
Huh. Well,
You
did,
know,
did you hear that, billionaires and grad students, that much of the CAP site is unexcavated? So to me, that would seem like the logical place to go. Go back to CAPS, really look for intact deposits and datable materials. Even if maybe OSL or some other technology to be employed. But it sounds like there's great potential to do additional research there. So amazing. Well, anything else you want to say about this incredible archaeological technology you've been working on?
no, I mean, it just intrigued me, and I'm still intrigued by it, and want to know. I want to know more about it. I want to understand it more, and but above all, I want to be able to date it so we can kind of hopefully come to some kind of resolution, at least in general, about where it may or may not fit into the North American archaeological record or the American uh, archaeological record, and also the old world. I mean, I think we owe it to ourselves, and I mean, yeah, often as an archaeologist, you have to ask yourself, well, why do we really care that much about this stuff? I mean, a lot of people probably don't care, but I think it's something you're born with. I think it's something if you really pursue it, it's something that you can't really explain why you think it's important. But uh, for knowledge sake is one thing, but I think to me, it gives you a perspective. It gives your society a perspective on, kind of grounds you into where you are, and it gives you that kind of insight that otherwise you wouldn't have, which I think is an important thing. It's kind of like doing your roots, on TV. You want your ancestor, where you came from. So it's like the more we can learn. These tools came from. It's
Sorry,
just
finish your thought.
intriguing. Well,
Yeah, I think that there is a self-discovery component to this. You know, it's not just, oh, how did first people get to the Americas? It's what in the world were ancient people like you and I doing, and where were we when, and how did we get there? And in this particular instance, if indeed there is an old world connection, and uh, and it sort of terminates around the same time that we see Lavawa terminating in the old world, we could be looking at dates along the lines of those that were put forth by Barbara Purdy. It's a possibility. We don't know, and that would be very, very early and very surprising. But it's uh, could be 8,000 years ago too. So and don't we get the date? We don't know. Um, but Really, really interesting conversation. Blaine, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with us, and hopefully we can generate some interest in this topic, and there can be some future research to explore it. I think those listening to this interview, ponder the implications and spread the word. And if you're interested in doing research along these lines, get in touch with Blaine or myself, and we can help you along. And in the meantime, tune in next time on Underground for another interesting archaeological discussion. And until then, stay curious. Thanks, Glenn. We'll see you later.
yeah, we enjoyed it.
Appreciate it.
Mhm.
Be well.